Dennis Arjo is professor of philosophy and religion here at Johnson County. He completed a BA in philosophy from the University of California, Santa Cruz, an MA in philosophy from the University of Colorado, Boulder, and a PhD in philosophy from the University of California, Santa Barbara. His primary area of research is the philosophy of education and comparative philosophy. He's beginning his 26th year here at the college. In his time with us, he's taught a number of classes in the humanities, including, try to get these all in, Introduction to Philosophy, Ethics, History of Ancient Philosophy, History of Modern Philosophy, and History of Asian Philosophy. In addition to his teaching, Dennis has also served as the president of the Faculty Association. And aside from his duties at the college, Dennis, like so many of us, messes around on the hammered dulcimer when he gets the chance. Okay, maybe we're going to hear about that? Maybe not, okay. For our presentation today, Professor Arjo has chosen Jack Kerouac's 1958 novel, The Dharma Bums. About the book, he says this: "The Dharma Bums helped spur an interest in Buddhism, and in an indirect but important way, an interest in philosophy. It also encouraged certain countercultural tendencies that were beginning to emerge when I read it at the age of 17. Just before we started, we were chatting. I had a very similar experience, and I think a lot of young readers in America do. Though On the Road is often sort of the cited book, The Dharma Bums always fascinated me, with being a real focus on that West Coast beat scene, especially Gary Snyder and Allen Ginsberg. So very excited about today's talk. At the end, we always have time for a few questions, though we will be trying to keep true to that hour mark. So ladies and gentlemen, Professor Dennis Arjo.
All right, well, thank you very much for coming, and let me reiterate my thanks to Michael and Maureen and everybody else who's puts on this wonderful series and to help make this possible. So yes, I'm going to be talking about this book, The Dharma Bums by Jack Kerouac, which I was given by my father, I think on my 17th birthday. For reasons that might emerge during the talk, it's a somewhat interesting choice for a father to give to an impressionable teenage son, but it did have a pretty big impact on me in the ways that Michael indicated. So I'm going to start with some very quick biographical comments about Jack Kerouac, in case you're not familiar with him. A little bit about the Beat generation, of which he was a very large part. I'm going to be fairly brief because all this is available on the internet. If you're interested in more details, fire up that Google and you can find all sorts of fascinating websites devoted to Kerouac's work and life and the Beats in general. So his proper name, at least the way he reported it, was Jean-Louis Le Bris de Kerouac. The Le Bris part is probably spurious. His birth certificate apparently just said Jean-Louis Kerouac, spelled with an I. Sounds French because it was. So he was born in the US. His parents were French Canadian, and French was actually his first language. He learned English later, and it wasn't until well into his childhood, actually, that he was a competent and confident speaker of English. Died in 1969, so as you can see, a fairly brief life as far as these go. He died at 47. The clinical reason for that early death would be complications due to alcoholism, so his struggles with alcohol and drinking are kind of a prevalent theme in his work, and I'll say a bit more about that. A few important things about his life. When he was 4, his older brother Gerard, who was 9, got rheumatoid fever and died. And this event haunted Kerouac himself for really the rest of his life. I'll come back to that. It also kind of broke up his family, his mother becoming an even more devout, serious Catholic, his father losing his faith and becoming a bit of a drunk and carouser. And you can kind of see how Kerouac sort of becomes both of those. So I'll return to those themes as well. Oh, okay. So a little bit about the Beat generation, if you're not familiar with this. So this is a name given to a literary poetry movement, kind of arose in the 1950s and peaked by the end of the 1950s, fed into the 1960s counterculture, anti-war movement, so there was a lineage there, which I'll talk a little bit about. A lot of people were involved to varying degrees with the Beats, but I'll just mention kind of the major ones that, with Kerouac, sort of formed the top of the Beat pantheon. So that's Allen Ginsberg, the poet, a good friend of Kerouac's. They met in school, but they were briefly students in Columbia. They got thrown out. William Burroughs, a somewhat older novelist, junkie, professional weirdo, who was kind of a godfather to the Beats. Neal Cassady, who was not much of a writer, but through the sheer force of his personality, had a great influence on Kerouac and Ginsberg and the Beats in general. Throw in a very famous picture of Kerouac and Neal Cassady looking quite manly there. So as I said, there's a kind of direct lineage between the Beats and the 1960s counterculture, hippie movement, but also the anti-war movement. All of these, with the exception of Kerouac, transitioned into that new youth culture rather successfully. So Ginsberg became a fixture in the counterculture as well as the anti-war movement. Burroughs continued to be sort of the weird uncle of them all. Neal Cassady actually drove the bus for the Merry Pranksters as they drove around the US, drinking frightening amounts of LSD and scandalizing people everywhere they went, so Ken Kesey in that crowd. Kerouac never did. Kerouac was very uneasy with the 60s counterculture, somewhat antagonistic actually. This despite the fact that he was often presented as sort of the grandfather of it all and the guiding spiritual light of it. So he was put into a role in the popular imagination which made him very uncomfortable and which he was really not too suited for. So interesting complications there, which I'll talk a bit about as well. So the book that put Kerouac on the literary map and made him into something of a cultural icon is On the Road, published in, I wrote these down because I forget dates, 1957. Like all of his, well not all, but most of his novels, it's not really a fictional work. It's a semi-fictional accounting of his true adventures as he and Neal Cassady in particular drove across the country, down into Mexico, and back across the country. For whatever reason, people are still writing about this. This book really struck a nerve. It became a bestseller and made Kerouac into a celebrity. He was not the kind of person who was ever going to be doing well as a celebrity. He was very uncomfortable in the limelight and did not really see himself as this towering figure of this literary movement. He rightfully thought lots of people were responsible for the Beat generation, not just him. But for better or worse, he became identified as this figure. So I put this version of On the Road because it's the one I own and read. So on the front cover it says, one of the most powerful, important novels of our time, the book that turned on a generation. So that's a pretty big status to have. Dharma Bums comes shortly after On the Road in terms of his output. He would publish eventually 12 novels, all of which he conceived of as one long, sprawling story, somewhat artificially broken up into books. So some of the other well-known ones, just real quick, Desolation Angels, which picks up the story told in Dharma Bums and continues it. The Subterraneans, Big Sur, which recounts his attempts to get sober in a cabin on the California coast. Kerouac was also a poet, so he published books of poetry, including most famously the Mexico City Blues. 242 choruses. He imagined this as a literary equivalent of a jazz solo going on for 242 choruses, which is a lot. That's a long solo. So maybe he's thinking of John Coltrane, who was rather notorious for very long solos. All right, so to get to the main show here. I couldn't resist doing this. So Dharma Bums has been reissued from various publishers over the years. And for whatever reason, it inspires very strange cover art. So this is the current Penguin Classic. So that says Nirvana, so the hitchhiker's like hitchhiking to Nirvana. This is like deliberately sacrilegious if you're a Buddhist. Not quite sure about that. No idea what's going on here. This was clearly made by people who never read the book, so I really don't know what's going on there. This is my version, which I still have, so it's tattered and torn. I was going to reread it for this talk, and realized if I did that, the pages would all fall out, so I had to buy a Kindle version, which was a little bit sacrilegious as well. But it says on the cover here of this kind of goofy one in yellow, the same blurb, by the man who launched the hippie world, the daddy of the swinging psychedelic generation, Jack Kerouac, author of On the Road. So on the back it continues, the book that turned on the psychedelic generation, a barrier-smashing novel about two rebels on a wild march for experience, capital E, from Frisco's swinging bars to the top of the snow-capped Sierras. Here are the orgiastic sexual sprees, the cool jazz bouts, the poetry love-ins, and the marathon binges of the kids who are hooked on sensation, capital S, and looking for the high, the Dharma bums. So this is a book my dad thought I should read at the age of 17. So as we'll see, yeah, there is some orgiastic sexual sprees, and it's not entirely inaccurate, but it's kind of a more complicated book than that blurb might suggest. All right, if Neil Cassidy immortalized as Dean Moriarty was the hero of On the Road, this person, Gary Snyder, is the hero of Dharma Bums. I found this picture. It was remarkably what Kerouac portrays him as looking like in the book. So here he is in kind of a Japanese garb. So in the book, he's called Jaffe Ryder. He was born in 1930, still alive. So Gary Snyder goes on to become a pretty serious scholar of Buddhism, a very serious practitioner of Buddhism, an environmentalist, a poet. He also spent some time as a logger, as a union organizer, so an anarchist. So he has had a very interesting life. So some of his works are listed there. I want to give him due credit. If I'm not mistaken, Nick, at the age of 92, he just recently published another volume of poetry, so he is still going strong. So Kerouac meets Snyder in San Francisco, mid-50s, about 1955, at a time when Buddhism was beginning to grow in popularity, at least among certain parts of American intellectual life. So he's kind of in a group that included D.T. Suzuki, who was translating and writing introductory books about Zen Buddhism. Alan Watts was another person, an even more kind of deliberate popularizer. And Snyder was kind of part of that same moment. So he was very interested in Zen Buddhism in particular. He eventually goes to Japan, studies under a master, takes his refuge vows, and becomes a truly practicing Buddhist. He knew Chinese, he knew Japanese, so he's a rather serious scholar. Kerouac meets him, and he's still got a bit of a wild man in him, so he is part of all these kind of crazy experiences that the book blurb suggests. So in the book, The Dharma Bums, there's a very nice conversation between the two characters, Jaffe Ryder and Ray Smith, who was the Kerouac version character, talking about Buddhism, and Snyder says he associates himself with this legendary Zen Taoist poet Han Shan, which means cold mountain in Chinese. Whether he existed is up for debate, but there's stories about this kind of wild Zen Taoist who hangs out in the mountains, living in caves. And so, as Kerouac describes it, Han Shan was a poet, a mountain man, a Buddhist dedicated to the principle of meditation, the essence of all things, a man of solitude who could take off by himself and live purely and true to himself. And this is how Jaffe is portrayed in The Dharma Bums, as kind of embodying these same qualities. All right. So a little bit about the book. So as I said, the books, all of Kerouac's books in general are just kind of fictionalized, lightly fictionalized versions of true stories that he lived. So they tend to not have much in the way of elaborate plots. So there's really, the book itself is, in terms of the, oops, what did I just do? The narrative, it's just kind of a series of events that happen that set the stage for Kerouac to meditate on all sorts of questions. So the initial thing, the book starts with Ray Smith, and that's Kerouac, and Jaffrey Ryder meeting in San Francisco, and Ryder is referred to as the #1 Dharma bum. So this is kind of the focus of the book. It proceeds then to a recounting of another true event, a poetry reading at the Sixth Gallery in San Francisco that was very kind of wild, very successful, and launched what became known as the San Francisco Renaissance in poetry. So a number of significant poets read at this event. This is where Ginsberg debuted his epic poem Howl, a very important piece of beat literature. Then moves on to Smith and Ryder climbing the California Matterhorn in the Sierra Nevadas. So Jaffe is trying to introduce Ray to mountaineering and get him out of the city where he's prone to drink too much, up into the high country and sort of turn him into kind of one of these Zen Taoist mountain poet types. After that, Smith hitchhikes home to South Carolina to spend Christmas with his family, his mother and sister and brother-in-law. He jumps on some freight trains along the way and has some adventures in Mexico along the way. He gets there and he spends most of the time in the woods meditating. He tries to convince his family that he's not crazy and he's not actually just wasting his life, but he's doing important things. His brother-in-law is not impressed and thinks he's got the bum part of Dharma bums right, maybe not the Dharma part. And they get into some interesting arguments. He ultimately tries to lay it all out. This is Buddhism. This is what I'm into right now. You should all become Buddhists. And they're like, yeah, no, weren't having it. So he leaves. He returns to the Bay Area, once again hitchhiking, jumping trains, going through Mexico for some adventures along the way. And he ends up spending the summer with, the late spring into early summer with Jaffe Ryder in a cabin in Corte Madera in Marin County, sort of north of San Francisco, across the Golden Gate Bridge, as Ryder prepares to leave to Japan for his entry into a monastery and becoming a serious Buddhist. So a little personal note here. I grew up in the Bay Area. We sort of moved around. So Corte Madera, the actual cabin, I believe, was in Mill Valley, which is right next door to Corte Madera. And I lived in Mill Valley as a child for 2 years. And it's on the foot of the Mount Tamalpais, absolutely beautiful place, redwoods. This is the background here is a shot of Muir Woods. So there's a wonderful scene towards the end of this part of the book where after a 3-day party, a going away party that goes on for 3 days, all sorts of shenanigans going on, Jaffe and Smith, Ray Smith, escape, kind of sneak out in the morning and go for a hike over Mount Tamalpais, which would be quite a hike, through Muir Woods into Stinson Beach on the other side, which is, when I was a child, we'd do that by car, but we would drive over Mount Tamalpais down to Stinson Beach and hope it wasn't foggy. So the descriptions here that Kerouac gives us are just lovely, and it's really kind of a magical part of the book. All right, it ends as Smith, the Kerouac character, is hitchhiking to Washington State to take up a post as a fire watchman in the Cascade Mountains, his assignment being particularly on something known as Desolation Peak. So back in this day, there was no satellite imagery. You couldn't watch for fires using satellite photos, so they would hire people to go live in one of these and spend 60 days in total solitude watching out for smoke and lightning strikes. So Kerouac, at the urging of Gary Snyder, actually did this. And I'll come back to this. In the Dharma Bums, it's portrayed as a pretty positive experience that leads to some kind of spiritual moment for Kerouac. In Desolation Angels, which comes next, it's described as 2 months of boredom and loneliness. So there might have been some ambivalence about this experience on Kerouac's part. He couldn't wait to get back to civilization. All right, so this is basically what happens in the book, in some sense not a whole lot. But the themes are what's interesting. So in this book, in a very pointed way, but it's really a theme of all of his books, Kerouac is looking for what I'm going to just call transcendent meaning, some way of understanding the world from kind of an eternal perspective that would make sense of and relieve his suffering and the suffering of everybody ultimately. So what kind of suffering? Well, Kerouac had his demons, and he's constantly looking for a way to be at peace, really, with himself. So I mentioned the death of his brother. When his brother died, the nuns at the school he went to declared him a saint, and Kerouac got this image of Girard as this holy, pure being that he himself could never be, and so he kind of always was unfavorably comparing himself to this image of his holy brother. Even in the Dharma Bums, which is telling the story of Kerouac's life before it really got kind of rough after the publication of On the Road, but even now his drinking is an issue. There's passages where Jaffe and other characters are expressing concerns about how much he drinks, and there's a lot of kind of guilt about him waking up hungover and feeling sick and squandering his opportunities. He is not very successful in relationships with women. He's kind of had some problems in that regard. He was married 3 times. So he does see himself, for better or worse, right or wrong, as a rather flawed being in need of redemption, and he struggles with a lot of this, on top of the ordinary difficulties of life. So the Dharma Bums, he's kind of looking, as always, for some kind of, I don't know, salvation, be a bit too strong, but some kind of redemption, some kind of insight into the nature of things that would relieve him of these problems. And he looks for this in 3 ways. So one is the beat movement itself. So there's kind of a beat aesthetic, a beat approach to life and how we can live that's going to elevate people above the mundanity of mid-century America suburbs. And so he quotes the character in the book that's supposed to be Allen Ginsberg, is grasping after life as much as you can because of its sweet sadness and because you'll be dead someday. So living for the moment, most intense experiences you could find. So this is what drives the interest in modern jazz, intensity of that music. Some drugs, smoking some weed, taking some amphetamines, certainly drinking. The poetry, the style of poetry that the beats exemplify, this kind of spontaneous explosion of words, very little editing, at least in theory. All of which was trying to get at this sense of immediacy, a way to find this transcendence in very concrete experiences at a day-to-day level. So in Dharma Bums, this part of his journey or his attempts to find some kind of redemption are represented by what he calls the place, capital T, capital P. The place is actually this place, Vesuvio's Cafe, which is on Columbus Street right off of Broadway. So I happened to be in San Francisco this summer and had some time to go to North Beach and sit in Vesuvio's and take pictures. So this is a picture I took just recently. So it's kind of a really cool place, I have to confess. Another personal connection here. I spent a lot of time, well, I think of my down and out years between getting my undergraduate degree and going back to graduate school, working in Berkeley and spending a lot of time in San Francisco, hanging out in places like this, having arguments with friends about philosophy and poetry and politics, and very kind of deliberately saying, spirit's still here, we're carrying the flame, some 30 years afterwards. So that's one place. Clearly at Dharma Bums, Desolation Angels is also a big part about this. Kerouac looks to nature as a kind of a solace and a place for finding meaning and harmony as well. So it's just depictions of these hikes he takes with Jaffe are very beautiful, always very positive and very poetic. So it's just an example of, you could pick at random, one of his accounts of his experiences. We'll qualify that a little bit. These kind of lovely accounts are always when they're on the way up the mountain. When he's coming down, Kerouac is often tired and sore and hungry and sick of the whole adventure and just wants to get back to civilization. So I think it's a rather deliberate dichotomy there, though nature always comes across as a friendly place. So the last one is Buddhism, which I'm going to talk a bit more about in more detail, but he has his kind of three avenues he's exploring to try to find this redemption. All right, so a bit about Kerouac's Buddhism. So I would argue that he's very earnest, very serious, and he's spending a lot of time reading Buddhist texts and Buddhist commentary. But his version of Buddhism is quite eclectic and quite syncretic. So he's trying to take bits and pieces of different Buddhist traditions and put them together into kind of his own thing. So he's a little all over the map as to just what kind of a Buddhist he is. So Buddhism is a very, very complicated tradition, divides into three major traditions or vehicles, each of which has multiple versions underneath it, and there's layers and layers of doctrine and teaching and practice, so nobody could really ever become an expert on Buddhism. But Kerouac does kind of sample. So he kind of admits this in this quote early from the book. So he's really just interested in the basic teachings of the Buddha himself. No, he's not. What's in the book draws on some actually fairly esoteric parts of specific Buddhist traditions. So he claims to be, early in the book, not interested in Zen. He sort of criticizes Jaffe's Zen Buddhism, says, I want to be an old-fashioned kind of Buddhist, Hinayana, what we now call Theravada Buddhist, kind of more traditional, more conservative. But at the same time, he's enamored with these Chinese Buddhists who come quite later in the tradition, these lunatic Zen poets who live in caves in the mountains, which is no part of Theravada Buddhism, really. He claims to be interested in Bodhisattva, most commonly referred to as Guan Yin these days, in a Chinese female version, but he refers to this Bodhisattva, holy person, as in using their Indian name when it's a male, so much earlier version of it. He's also very individualistic as a Buddhist, so he's not interested in formal Buddhist practice. Unlike Jaffe, who does go join a monastery and become a serious practicing monk, Kerouac has no inclination to do that sort of thing at all. And again, a little bit technical, just real quick. Most of what you see in the actual text where he tries to articulate his Buddhist visions seem to come from these two traditions, which are early Mahayana Buddhism and highly philosophical, very difficult texts. So this is the emptiness school, which denies that anything has self-identity, and the Yogacara school suggests that everything is a manifestation of our perceptions of the world. Nothing really exists outside the mind in a sense. So very far from the Theravada Buddhism that he claimed to be attached to, and very far from the Four Noble Truths. So, as I say, he's a little bit all over the map. I would also add that he never really gets too far from his Catholicism that he was brought up with. So towards the end of Dharma Bums, he starts bringing in comparisons between Buddhism and Christianity, and talks about Jesus, he talks about St. Paul, much to the annoyance of Jaffe Ryder, who wants none of that. He has zero interest in Christianity, so that's one of the tensions that occurs in the book. All right, so just to get a little bit more about that, let me take a drink here. So early in the book, Kerouac says one of his meditative practices is to read the Diamond Sutra, early Mahayana text, and again, a rather difficult one, deliberately paradoxical, self-contradictory. So his practice is to read this. So just to give you a very small flavor of what the Dhamma Sutra is like. So this is the Buddha preaching or teaching to one of his monks. So good men and women seeking the consummation and complete enlightenment, right, the goal of Buddhist practice, must create this resolved attitude of mind. I must liberate all living beings. But he then turns around and says, yet when all have been liberated, verily not anyone has been liberated. Okay, so you can think about what that might mean. So Kerouac clearly likes to emulate this kind of paradoxical language. So here's just a sample. So he has a vision. This is when he's meditating in the woods outside his mother's house in South Carolina. So he has a vision of some sort, and he says, if the vision was devoid of any sensation of I being myself, it was pure egolessness, just simply wild, ethereal activities devoid of any wrong predicates, devoid of effort, devoid of mistake. Everything's all right, I thought. Form is emptiness, and emptiness is form, and we're here forever in one form or another, which is empty, what the dead have accomplished, this rich, silent hush of the pure awakened land. So clearly in the vein of the Diamond Sutra. All right. So what is this Dharma bum then? We can sort of bring this all together. What is he referring to with the title? And this is the sort of thing at 17, I was like, well, I want to be one of those. So what was kind of for sale here? So I see it now as his attempt to synthesize these three impulses. So they're kind of beatnik, they reject sort of societal constraints, they're hip, they're not square, they're into jazz and drinking and smoking pot and all of that. But they're in touch with nature, they could throw on a rucksack and go climb a mountain, and they're also a Buddhist, bhikkhu, or bodhisattva, or something. So in this image of the Dharma, Dharma, if you don't know, is a term from Indian philosophy. It has lots of different meanings, but in this context, it's the teaching of the Buddha, so it's Buddhist teaching. So there's a few examples of what exactly might a Dharma bum be like in the book, and none of them are horribly successful for Kerouac. It's kind of the underlying sadness of the book, that as much as he tries, he's never able to find lasting peace here. So the book opens with a really remarkable episode where Kerouac's jumping on a train in Los Angeles trying to get to San Francisco. And he ends up sharing a boxcar with this other bum. And they get to talking, and it turns out this little bum has a clipping that he stole from a reading room in the Los Angeles Library of a prayer from St. Teresa of Avila, a kind of Catholic saint. And Kerouac is clearly just deeply touched by this image of this little bum sort of slipping through the shadow. Nobody hardly ever sees him, but he's got this very profound understanding and has this icon from St. Teresa. So Kerouac calls him the first genuine Dharma bum he ever met. So there's no Buddhism here. This is St. Teresa devotion to a saint, but Kerouac sees a kindred spirit in this bum. Who kind of haunts the book. He keeps sort of coming back in Kerouac's reveries. There's a rather notorious episode where Jaffe and the character that represents Allen Ginsberg and Kerouac end up trying to do a version of a Tibetan practice of tantric sex, which involves sex, but for the sake of spiritual heightening and enlightenment. Whether that was really going on or whether this is just sex for the ordinary kinds of reasons, I think we can fair to ask. But this is kind of another element of the beat lifestyle, being sexually uninhibited, casting off sexual restraint, being given a bit of a Buddhist twist. There's more than one epic drunken conversation that Kerouac records among his beat friends where they drink and party, but spend the whole time having these literary, intellectually informed discussions about important things, including Buddhism. And they spend a lot of time deciding who's a bodhisattva and what sort of bodhisattva and things of that sort. So again, kind of a mixing of the different avenues. My favorite part of the whole book probably is this, where during one of these conversations, Jaffe talks about this vision he has of what he calls a rucksack revolution. So I'll let you read the passage, it's not long, but he envisions all these young Americans fed up with sitting in their suburban homes, watching TV, and stifling social conformity. They throw it all off, strap a backpack on their back, and go marching into the mountains to be, yet again, Zen lunatic poets and things of that sort. All right. So as I said, none of these really work. Maybe the one that came closest is actually the last. If there is a direct inspiration in Dharma bums for a lot of the hippie ethos, it would be this rucksack revolution. So perhaps they had an influence there. So the little bum of St. Teresa becomes yet another person that Kerouac realizes he'll never be that pure and good. And he kind of haunts the book in a literal sense. He's described that this small guy who's thin who just sort of drifts around and no one ever knows he's there. So he's almost a ghostly figure. Kerouac is not too comfortable with the tantric sex party. He initially doesn't want to be part of it. He doesn't want to take his clothes off. He says he doesn't like taking his clothes off in front of people. If there's more than one, and particularly if there's men around, he's worried that this is not a good thing to do, and he's kind of regretting the prospects of giving up the celibacy he's been trying to practice as he becomes a Buddhist. There are some other scenes along these lines later in the book, and Kerouac is always on the outside looking in, so clearly he was never very interested in pursuing that particular route. The problem with drunken all-night conversations is, of course, you end up waking up hungover and sick and kind of miserable. So he ends up rejecting that. We put a passage up. What he's left with is the nature part. So at least in the Dharma Bums, nature kind of is the thing that doesn't let him down, at least so long as he's going up the mountain. The problem, of course, is you always have to come down. So the first passage where he's climbing the Matterhorn in the Sierras, he's all excited, he's feeling great, and initially he thought, no, we got to bring some wine up the mountains, and Jaffe's like, no, you're not going to need any wine where we're going, and so Kerouac is at first quite convinced. So it's a lot greater than the place, getting drunk in there on a fresh Saturday morning like this, all bleary and sick, and here we are by the fresh, pure lake, walking along this good air. By God, it's a haiku in itself, right? So he sees this as poetry. As I mentioned, the novel ends with Kerouac going up to the mountain to be a lookout on Desolation Peak. And at least as rendered in this work, this is largely a very positive thing. And towards the very end of the book, he has a vision of Jaffe, who's by now in Japan studying Buddhism. Where he says this, you can read it for yourself, but he kind of feels vindicated, and he finally understands what Jaffe's been trying to teach him, and so he sees this as having gone to desolation and learned all. But of course, he does have to go back down to civilization at the end, so it ends on this kind of bittersweet note. But here, at least, he does seem to think that ultimately it's nature that's going to provide him with this some kind of understanding of himself and the world that lets him find some kind of peace. So I will stop there. Stunned silence.
All right, thank you, Dennis.
Thanks.
As promised, we do have some time for questions. Anyone?
So how does Jack Kerouac's version of Buddhism inform your scholarship and studies of Buddhism? Or does it?
Well, it was an entry. I would say it was an entry point. I think it's a complicated thing with him himself. I do think he was very sincere, and he did spend a lot of time and effort studying Buddhist texts. So it's not like he doesn't know what he's talking about. I think he does. I don't think he ever made a serious effort to become a real Buddhist in a sense of practicing Buddhism. It was more an intellectual thing, which he tried to put into practice, but as I say, kind of in this very eclectic, individualistic way, which is what I've learned of Buddhism. It really, when they say practice, they mean practice. It's a thing you live in a very deep way. It's not just having certain ideas that you believe. And so I mentioned, Jaffe goes to Japan and takes what are known as the refuge vows. So this is a kind of a formal entry into the Buddhist community. So you vow to take refuge in three things: the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. The Sangha being the Buddhist community that you're now going to be a part of. And that comes with obligations and duties and moral rules about what you do and what you don't do. It's not all that compatible with this freewheeling, beatnik kind of a life. Zen seemed to be how a lot of these Western Buddhists kind of made their peace when they have their cake and eat it too there. Because in the Zen tradition, it's suspicious of studying texts forever and ever. It's more about action. So one of the arguments that Jaffe and Ray Smith have is Jaffe's a Zen Buddhist. He just wants action and doing stuff. Kerouac sees himself as more as a scholarly, old-fashioned Buddhist who studies the sutras over and over and over. So you do get stories in Zen Buddhism of these drunken monks who do go off and live in caves up in the mountains. But it'd be a mistake to take that as particularly exemplary of what Buddhism is. It's not much of that, really. So these are kind of stories you can use to make interesting points, but they're not really figures that Buddhists are meant to emulate. So in my personal sense, this piqued my interest. So I went off to UC Santa Cruz, took classes in Indian philosophy, read a lot of Buddhism, a lot of Alan Watts, a lot of D.T. Suzuki, but eventually kind of came to see that kind of Western Buddhism is a bit problematic in some respects, from a scholarly standpoint.
Yeah, you said I'm sorry. You said there's a continuation of this?
In Desolation Angels,
Okay.
yes.
Sometimes authors continue because they're not quite done with the characters, or they're not quite done with the stories, or they want to correct what they've done before. Did you get any sense?
In this case, it's because he wasn't done living, so he went on to have more adventures, and he just writes them up and publishes them as a so-called novel. There is evolution. I think ultimately the story gets a bit darker, as particularly after On the Road happens. It's kind of ironic. He has this enormous success, which should be a good thing, but it was very tough on him. In large part because he wasn't getting attention as a writer so much as just this cultural figure, which he did not really want to be. He's not somebody who took well to criticism. He got a lot, both for people who thought him and his friends were just a bunch of debauched weirdos doing immoral things, but the criticism of the writing stung as well. So Truman Capote rather famously said, "On the Road is not writing, it's typewriting," because he wrote it on this big scroll he just fit into his typewriter, and it's like very free-flowing and minimally edited. And so the story goes on. Deleuze's legend, he kind of gave himself this name and sees this as one continuous story. It does get kind of more and more bleak as he struggles to really kind of find a way to live with himself. So I think that's why he just kept writing. It was just all part of this attempt to find a way to live in this world that he had serious problems with. Yes?
What was your personal favorite takeaway from this novel? I know you said that your father gave it to you. It must have struck a very deep chord.
Yeah. Well, the impact it had, again, it sort of piqued my interest in Buddhism, and I was already kind of getting interested in Eastern philosophy, and that helped me find Western philosophy. So there's definitely that. But I was also somebody who, by my last year in high school, I had long hair. I was seeing my fellow students as sort of boring conformists. I was like looking at what seemed to be the plan of life laid out, which you go to college to get a job, and then you move into a suburban house like the one I was growing up in, and kind of just suddenly like, wait, you don't have to do that. You can do all this crazy stuff instead. That's like something people do. I was never going to be the same. I gave up on getting a degree in architecture, started thinking about getting a degree in either English or philosophy, and could have gone to UC Berkeley, or all the sort of academic superstars my high school went to, but I chose UC Santa Cruz because it was the kind of crazy hippie school in the Redwoods. So that was it tilted me very much in that direction. So books can do that.
Any other questions? Dennis, thank you.
Thank you. Thanks a lot for coming.